Hello, it's good to be with you today. This is our study of the book of Daniel, and we're delighted you could join with us. We hope it's been a good day for you as we've worshiped God this day. It should be an encouragement to us and remind us that God is sovereign, God is on the throne, and God is helpful. And that really takes us to the book of Daniel, because that's much of what the book of Daniel is all about. And we will see that even more so today in our study. Today we are in the 11th chapter, chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. And we encourage you to get your Bible out and to join with us as we study that together. And also as we do this to get out a pen and get out your notes, because we'll kind of follow some things along together. Chapter 11 is a long chapter. And chapter 11, as we look at some of these things, are going to reveal some things to us about this vision of Daniel. Chapter 10 kind of led up to the vision. And it was a vision, verse 1 of chapter 10, about conflicts, which the footnote tells us was about wars. And Daniel was very troubled about that. And so in the 11th chapter, the entire chapter is the vision. So this is the longest vision in the book of Daniel. And if you've already read it, it is very confusing. And it will make sense when we break this down to three segments. But just to give you, for instance, let's turn to verse 15 and verse 16 of chapter 11. And let me just read you a couple of thoughts here. It says, the king of the north will come and will cast a siege ramp and capture a fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases. That's common in this chapter, he and him. Well, who's he, who's him? And it gets very confusing. He talks about king of the south, king of the north. And sometimes it's just hard for us to kind of figure those things out. And so we'll walk through this with you. And I think once we look at the overall outline of this, it will really make sense to you, and it will help you. And again, one of the things that really is powerful about this chapter, it shows the wisdom of God and the sovereignty of God. Long before these events take place, God is putting these things in shape so they can be fulfilled. And what we're going to see here is details, minute details, and long before they ever took place, which reminds us that only God would have known these things. These details are so precise that many critical scholars believe that this book, this chapter particularly, was written after the fact. In other words, these things took place, and then someone else, borrowing Daniel's name, wrote about it. It'd be like you and I writing about World War II. Well, the war is over, and now we're writing about it. That's a liberal concept of that. I believe the God of heaven can tell us details even before they take place centuries and centuries ahead of time. So that's some of the things we're going to look at. Verse 1 of chapter 11 really fits in with the end of chapter 10, where there it says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Now, I think that's important, remembering that Darius was not of Judah. He was a foreign king, and yet Daniel was encouraging him because he's going to be somewhat in this vision himself as the things take place. Now, when you look at your outline and you look at this beige box in the middle, this is the overview of the chapter. This is helpful for you, because without this, it really gets confusing for you. So verses 1 through 19 deal with the present time of Daniel dealing with Darius the Mede up to Antiochus Epiphanes. He is a Syrian king, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. But the first section covers that time period. The second section deals with really the persecution done by Antiochus. We read about him earlier, one of the earlier visions that we read, where he went into the temple and he put in his idols. He offered a pig upon the altar of God, and he just blasphemed God. Well, this is going to bring this up again. And then the third section, the final section, verse 29 through 45, is going to deal with the Romans and the Roman persecution of God's people, which at that time are going to be Christians. And so that's kind of the overview. That will help you somewhat to put these names and he's and hims together there. Now, before we get to the text itself, again on your outline, on the right-hand side in the pink box, The use of king 19 times in this chapter. King of the south 7 times, king of the north 7 times. And so this chapter is not so much about God's people. It's not about the coming of the Messiah. It's not about spiritual things, but these conflicts. And really what this is about, as we've seen in Daniel chapter 2 with this statue, and the head of gold was Babylon, and then would come the Medes, and then would come the Greeks. What this chapter shows is the transitions. How do we get from one to the other to the other? This chapter shows that. And then we also see below this on your outline in the gray box, the significance of time. All things are done in God's time. Verse 6 is going to say, after some years. Verse 8 is going to say, after some years. Verse 13, an interval of some years. So time is going to go on throughout this, and we'll identify a couple places that. And then 3 times, the appointed time. Appointed by God. God has to have all this stuff arranged, and when it's the right time, God's going to fulfill these things. So let's look at the text, and let's begin. Verse 2, as he talks about Darius the Mede in verse 1, now I will tell you the truth, he says, behold, 3 more kings are going to rise in Persia. So Darius is the first one. This is when this takes place. 3 more kings will follow Darius. And then he says in verse 2, there will be a 4th gain more riches than all of them. That 4th king is Artaxerxes. He's the same king we read about in the book of Esther. And Esther stood before that king. He was very, very wealthy. His wealth led him to try to attack Greece. That backfired, and the Greeks took over. So at the end of verse 2, it says, as soon as he became strong through his riches, he will arise a whole empire against the realm of the Greeks. Verse 3, and a mighty king will arise. That's Alexander the Great, the Greeks. A mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Once again now, we go back to Daniel chapter 2 and this statue of these different kingdoms coming. Here is the transition. How did it go from the Medes to the Greeks? Well, Darius, and then these 3 kings, and then Artaxerxes, and then the influence that happened upon that. Now what's interesting, between verse 2 and verse 3, there's really a period of 150 years. And there's really 8 more Persian kings that take place. But the significance here is upon these kings that's listed there. It says in verse 4, as soon as he has arisen, he is Alexander the Great, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. Alexander died at the age of 33. So as quickly as he went up, he went down. Now notice what it says here. When he dies, his kingdom split up in 4s. The earlier vision in chapter 2 and chapter 4 identified that. And then it'll be parceled out to the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants. Alexander had a son, but when he died, his wife and his child was murdered. And so the kingdom was divided between his 4 main generals. That's what takes place there. And it says, not to his descendants, not according to his authority, which he had yielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside him. Now again, how specific this prophecy is, and hundreds of years in advance. Now, what follows, as the Greek Empire was divided in 4s, we're going to follow just 2 of them. The other 2 really are not significant to the people of God. So we're going to follow the king of the south. That's going to be Egypt. That's led by the Ptolemies. Ptolemy the first, and Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. So when we read king of the south, that's Egypt. It might help you in your Bibles to write above that, or in your margin, actually to write that. Every time you see king of the south, write Egypt, because that's what we're talking about. The king of the north is Syria, and that's the Antiochus. Antiochus first, and then there's Antiochus Epiphanes. And so we're going to read about Egypt and Syria battling each other. And the area in which they fight happens to be where Judah is. And so this is involvement with the people of God. And so again, this is the transitions through that statue we've seen in chapter 2. So now we go to verse 5. The king of the south, that's Egypt, will grow strong, along with one of his princes, that would be his son, Antiochus II, who will gain ancestry over him, attain dominion, and his dominion will be a great dominion indeed. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of south, her name actually was Bernice. Bernice was the daughter of Ptolemy. She will come to the king of the north, that's Antiochus, to carry out a peaceful arrangement. What happens is they got married. But what also happened is that Antiochus was already married. And so he put his first wife kind of away and married the Egyptian woman. Now, this is to form a peace alliance. But what happened was Antiochus's first wife caught wind of that, and she poisoned everybody. She poisoned her husband, Antiochus. She poisoned Bernice. They had a child. She poisoned that child. And so that alliance didn't last. What's interesting, it reads like a soap opera. It really does. And so in verse 6, it says, the daughter of the king of south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, because both of them are going to be dead. But she will be given up along with all those who brought her in, and those who sired her as well as he who supported her in these times. Now, you might say, well, how do you know all this stuff? How do you know it was Bernice and all these things? Well, secular history. And secular history is really very close here to what the Bible's saying. This is how we know it matches. Verse 7, one of the descendants of her line, that happened to be her brother, Bernice's brother, who also was an Antiochus, who was also Ptolemy, let me get that straight myself, who was also Ptolemy, will rise in his place, and he will come after their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. So what we have is this marriage alliance didn't last because the first wife killed everybody. And so Bernice's brother, another Ptolemy, Egyptians, they're now coming in and they're attacking the Syrians. That's what's taking place. In verse 8 and verse 9, all that will take place. And so we go down to verse 10 and 11. We read about the kings and north and south, and they're fighting each other for a long period of time. This is what's taking place. Verse 14, now in those times, many will rise up against the king on the south, the violent ones among your people. That's talking about the people of God. They're going to rise up against the Egyptians, and they're going to do some fighting. Then the king of the north will come, there comes the Syrians, cast a siege ramp and capture a well-fortified city, and the fortress of the south will not stand. He who comes against him, against the people from the north, that being the Syrians, will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land. Twice we're going to read about the beautiful land. That's Jerusalem. So what happens is the Syrians come in to Jerusalem, and they capture part of it, okay, with destructive hands. He will set his face to come with power of his whole kingdom. Verse 17, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So once again, there tries through marriage to be a peace alliance, but this again fails. And so Egypt and Syria continue to battle each other through all of this. And so this is just a continuation of this transition we're talking about. Verse 20 says, then in his place, this is Antiochus the first, then in his place, or second now, Antiochus second, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. And again, what happened is after Antiochus was killed, someone rose up who claimed to be his son. He really wasn't. He was assassinated. And then we get to verse 21. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the true son of Antiochus. And as we've read about earlier, he's described as a wicked, ruthless, a deceptive person. And so beginning now in this section here, we follow Antiochus Epiphanes. And you see on your outline up in that beige box, he reigns from 175 to 164. And so in his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of the kingship has not been confirmed, but he will come in time of tranquility and seize the kingdom of intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. And that is, he actually goes into Egypt. His father, Antiochus I, the king of the north, fought the king of the south several times, but he never really got to go into Egypt. Antiochus Epiphanes actually goes into Egypt. And he will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them. He will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up the strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army of war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Again, we see all this wicked. What's missing in all this is God. There's no God in all this. This is just ruthless, godless men fighting each other. That same thing is taking place today. When we remove the element of God, following his word, this is what we get into. And so it's just a lot of turmoil here as we see this. And so as the fighting goes on in verse 28, he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. The Holy Covenant is Jerusalem, the people of God. He's against Jews. He's against Judah. And he has done, as we said earlier, despicable things to the holy place of God. He has blasphemed God in many ways. And so his heart is against the holy covenant of God, it says in verse 28. Verse 29, at the appointed time. And once again, notice, it's like an hourglass. God has a timetable. And when God is ready for this kingdom to go down, he will make this kingdom go up. Keep your finger here if you want. Go back, go all the way back with me to chapter 2 of Daniel. And in verse 21, because this is so fitting for this chapter. Daniel 2:21, as it talks about God, it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise men. And that's what God's doing. So, at the appointed time, verse 29 of chapter 11, it says, he will return and come to the south. But this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. So once again, Antiochus and the Syrians are coming down to Egypt. But this time, it doesn't turn out well. For the ships of Kittim, verse 30. Kittim is Rome. So as Syria and Egypt are battling each other, they're kind of making each other weak, Rome is getting strong, and they're sending their fleet over, and here comes the Romans. It says, for the ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action so that he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So couldn't go into Egypt this time. He goes back and kind of ransacks Judah one more time, and he's just upset. Forces will rise. From him forces will arise, desecrate the sanctuary, the fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. I think in this time period here, we're beginning to talk about what's happening with Rome and through the Caesars and how they too attacked Jerusalem and did the things that, verse 32 talks about the godlessness, and they acted wickedly toward the covenant. And the people that know their God will display strength and take action. Might even be the Maccabees there who kind of rose up against the Romans at that time period. Talks about those who have insight in the next verse. Among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword, the flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. This is exactly what Rome did when they attacked Jerusalem. Many will fall, and they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in their hypocrisy. And so again, just seeing the destruction taking place. In verse 36, then the king there is not north or south. The king here is the Caesars. We're dealing with Romans. The king will do as he pleases, and will exalt and magnify himself above every god. This is when the Caesars started declaring that they were gods. So they were above the river gods and the sun gods and Apollo and Zeus and all those other gods. They felt like that they themselves were the greatest gods, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, which is Jehovah. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that is what is decreed will be done. And again, that's image of Matthew 24, when he talks about the abomination of desolations. He will show no regard for the gods of his father, nor the desire of women. That deals some of the homosexuality that was going on among the Caesars. Nor will he show regard for any of the other gods. He will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a God of fortress, a God of whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. The God of the Caesars was power, strength, and that's how they viewed that. And so they conquered the world, and they were mighty and strong. And again, that describes that fourth kingdom in that Daniel 2 image there. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses. With the help of a foreign god, he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over many, and will parcel out land for a price. So he's just conquering the world, as that's describing. At the end of time, the king of the south. Now, I believe we're not talking about Egypt anymore. I think we're down the road. We're dealing with the Roman time period. And so, king of the south here, most likely is the Parthians. Parthians rise up, and they fight the Romans. And so the king of the south, verse 40, will collide with him. And the king of the north, that's no longer the Syrians. The Syrian, we're down the road in time now. So the Syrians are no more. King of the north now would be the early Germans, the Gothics, and some of those. And they rise up. And so we got these two forces that come against Rome. And as you study Roman history, you notice Rome gets weak. And eventually they are overtaken, particularly by the Parthians. And they're no more. And so the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen, with many ships, and he will enter countries and overflow them and pass through. And he will also enter the beautiful land. Once again, we're talking about Jerusalem. And many countries will fall. And he again describes even Edom and Moab, some of these Old Testament countries, that this once powerful Rome is now fallen to pieces, and place by place by place is falling. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and against the land of Egypt will not escape. And so again, the Parthians and the Germans and the Gothics are coming down. They're just taking over all these places. But rumors from the east and the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate the enemy. And again, just wars and rumors of wars, as Matthew 24 describes this time period. After the greatness of the Caesar empires, there was so much political internal fighting, generals rising up, taking over, Caesars being assassinated. The country became weak. And other nations then were allowed to come in and conquer them and overcome them in that way. Chapter ends with verse 45. He will pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. That's the area between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem. And yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. And what we find once again is all of this is not by military strength. All of this is not by great strategy of generals and commanders. This is all by the design of God. God is in charge, and God is doing these things. So, kind of a tough chapter. And really what this chapter is about wars and about fighting and this nation rising and that nation rising. But all of that puts us back to chapter 2 in that transition from one kingdom to the next kingdom to the next kingdom, just as God had designed it. And in that fourth kingdom is when God's kingdom would come about. Now, from this, let's talk about some lessons that we learn here. One of the first lessons that we learn here from this is we see why Daniel was troubled with his vision. I mean, this is a troublesome vision. You know, it would say back in chapter 10 and verse 17 that Daniel had lost his strength. In other places, his breath had left him. His color had changed because these conflicts were very troublesome to him. And we're reading about a lot of death, a lot of fighting here. And the people of God are kind of caught in the middle. They're going to be bothered by the Syrians, they're going to be bothered by the Egyptians, they're going to be bothered by the Romans, and kind of tossed here and there. And again, that was troublesome. A second lesson that we see here is that these conflicts point to God being in charge and knowing exactly what was going to happen. None of this is a surprise. Daniel's like give the daily newspaper long before the events ever take place. Daniel's able to see these things and understand them just as God would want them. And then the final lesson I'd have you to look at and to see and appreciate as we think about this is the sovereignty of God is seen. Way back during the time of the Persians, when we had Artaxerxes, you remember the story of Esther. Haman, the general, rose up and he wanted to extinguish all the Jews. And that's when Esther said that she needed to do something. Mordecai, her uncle, said, have you not been put in this position for such a time as this? And she goes before the king, Artaxerxes, and the tide changes. But God protected his people. And on another occasion, when we think about Antiochus Epiphanes and how he came into Jerusalem and desecrated, blasphemed the service of God, he tried to eliminate all the people of God, but he failed. Then years later, here comes the Caesars, and they capture Jerusalem, and they burn the temple down, and they try to execute all the Christians. That takes us to books like Peter, where Peter talks about that fiery trial, or the book of Revelation, where we read about Antipas and some others who were killed by the sword, and all that hostile time. Yet, they were not successful. Here you and I are today on another continent. The kingdom of God still goes on. And we end, if you look in this blue box, from this quotation from Daniel 2, that vision of that statue, in verse 44, as it talks about this, it says, there is a kingdom which will never be destroyed, nor left for another people. It will endure forever. And so what we read about in chapter 11 is history lessons. Where are the Syrians? They're not the way they were back here. Where's the Egyptians? Not like they were back here. Where are the Romans? Not like they were back there. Where's the Ptolemies? Where's the Antiochus? Where are the Caesars? They're all historical footnotes. But where are the people of God? They're worldwide. They're thriving today, just as you are. And so that helps us to see that. Well, next week, we in the book. It's hard to believe we're coming to the conclusion here. Next week is chapter 12. It's the shortest chapter in the book. And we'll tie a little bow about this entire book and kind of try to put everything back together again as we think about this powerful, powerful book. But I hope this kind of gives a little clarity. Chapter 11 can be confusing, but when you see it the way we've tried to put out before you, maybe it'd be good to go back through one more time and to read it, reading Egypt and reading Syria and reading Rome in this, and I think that will bring some clarity and help you to understand. This is a vision that God wanted Daniel and his people to know. These things are going to be troublesome times, but God's still in charge, and you're going to be okay. And that's what we need to know as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.